Our presenter is Erin Kukura. She holds an MS and an RD, and she is a UCSD Recreation Registered Dietitian at REMAC. She's also a UCSD alumna, and she's passionate about working with others to live healthier, happier lives, and to most importantly, have a healthy relationship with food. Go ahead, Erin, and kick it off.
Awesome, and thank you for that amazing introduction, as always. So let's get started. And as always, feel free to leave any questions or comments throughout the presentation, and then definitely at the end, there will be plenty of time for Q&A as well. So with that, we are going to get started talking about digestive health today. And kind of what we'll review is, what is the gut microbiome and why is this important? I know there's been a lot of research and headlines, so we'll really get into how our gut microbiome impacts our health. And then what impacts our gut microbiome. So specifically, diet and lifestyle factors is what we'll focus on for today. And we'll touch on fiber, prebiotics, probiotics, fermented foods, and lastly, what you can do to optimize your own digestive health. Alrighty, so getting into the gut microbiome, our individual microbiome consists of trillions of organisms that include bacteria, fungi, parasites, and viruses that reside throughout our entire digestive tract. But the majority of these really reside within the large intestine. And we have heard, I'm sure you have all heard recently, a lot of headlines around our microbiome and health and immune system. So our gut microbiome really does play an important role in optimizing our immune system. One of the ways that it does this is to help maintain what's known as the gut barrier, which will prevent pathogens from getting through and causing more damage or some type of immune system response. But there also is the production of what's known as short chain fatty acids. And these are really special metabolites that are essentially the byproduct of fermentation of undigested carbohydrates by these bacteria. And these are really helpful because they help lower the pH of the intestine, which means that pathogens typically can't survive in that environment. They affect gut motility and are also helpful in reducing inflammation. We also find that these bacteria synthesize vitamins, so in particular vitamin K, vitamin B12, and other B vitamins. I do want to note that for B12, even though this is produced by bacteria, we as the human or host in this situation don't actually get to really, we don't really absorb or utilize any of that. The bacteria produce it and then they're using it for their own needs, but they're still producing it. And then lastly, the microbiome also is essential for the metabolism of energy and other specific nutrients. So in particular, there's specific compounds that are known as phytonutrients within a lot of plant foods that contain really beneficial components like antioxidants that are helpful for things like reducing inflammation. And these are essentially metabolized and are activated by the gut microbiome. So kind of in general, there is this association between a more diverse microbiome, that's more typically associated with health, while lower diversity or a dysbiosis is correlated to many more chronic diseases. So in general, we're seeing links between the gut microbiome and a lot of disease states, such as type 2 diabetes, inflammatory bowel disease, rheumatoid arthritis, asthma, cardiovascular disease, and even some cancers. And then there's also what's known as the gut-brain axis. And so there are also emerging links between the gut microbiome and anxiety and depressive disorders. So pretty much any and all conditions out there, they're finding some link to the gut microbiome. So what impacts our individual gut microbiomes? So every individual has a unique and diverse set of microbes that really gets firmly pretty well established by the age of 3. And so I'll kind of touch on this later, but they're really finding that individuals aren't having these large shifts in their microbiome, even with interventions, which I'll touch on a little bit later. But genetics, birthing process, infant feeding practices, and the environment are really what help to establish that microbiome, especially by the age of 3. And then after that, and during that time too, things like diet, stress, antibiotics, other medications, illness, and age can all impact the gut microbiome to some degree as well. So one of the big things that a lot of the research has been on is how diet impacts the microbiome, which is what we're going to spend a lot of the time focused on for today. And really the biggest nutrient that has the greatest potential to influence the gut microbe is actually dietary fiber. So as I was mentioning earlier, in a lot of the studies that they're looking at, when individuals are having increased fiber, they're not having these large, or even, they're not really having a shift in terms of changing the composition of their microbiome, but they are finding that increased fiber will lead to increased abundance in those bacteria that produce those beneficial short chain fatty acids. And so this is why when a lot of reviews and literature looks at things like individuals following a vegan or vegetarian diet, which is typically higher in fiber compared to an omnivore diet, there isn't a consistent association between these kinds of diets and the microbiome composition. So although these shifts aren't being observed in individuals on a vegan or vegetarian or a high fiber diet, there are changes at the species level of bacteria that are also where we're seeing increased short chain fatty acid production in vegetarians or vegans and individuals with high fiber. So to sum it up, individuals that are consuming more amounts of fiber are not seeing shifts in their microbiome, but instead they're seeing increased production of short chain fatty acids and increased bacteria at the species level that produce those metabolites. So likewise, individuals that were fed a complete opposite diet, a high protein, low carb diet, had significantly reduced production of those short chain fatty acids. So we really see that fiber is really driving this production of this specific metabolite that's really beneficial. And just to look at kind of the other, macronutrients and how they affect the gut microbiome. So in terms of looking at protein, in general, the plant-based proteins are going to be much more effective at promoting a beneficial microbiome. And this is solely because they contain fiber. So things like beans and lentils and tofu are going to have that positive effect versus eggs and meats do not contain any of that fiber. With fat, we kind of see that the recommendations that are already out there are still kind of what apply. So high fat and saturated fat typically should be more avoided, while monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fats should be encouraged because these help with lowering inflammation. And then carbohydrates, the type of carbohydrate that's consumed seems to have a really considerable effect on the microbiome. And this is what we'll get much more into in depth. So before we talk about carbohydrates, I do just want to highlight kind of the current limitations and areas of future research, because there's a lot of headlines and misinformation out there about the gut microbiome. So because the microbiome is so highly variable and individualized, we do not know what is actually a quote unquote healthy or even a quote unquote unhealthy microbiome. You can have multiple individuals that are free of diseases that have very different microbiomes. So there isn't any gold standard or anything that they can really elucidate right now, or even to check someone's microbiome and say if you're healthy or not. There's also this issue of responders versus non-responders. So as I mentioned, that dietary fiber was really helping to fuel those beneficial short chain fatty acids. There are instances of individuals that actually don't have that increase of short chain fatty acids, even with the increase of fiber. So there still is a lot that we don't fully know in terms of that pathway or that mechanism, or even why some people respond and others don't. And as I mentioned, there is definitely links between the microbiome and chronic diseases. So really the areas of future research and current research is how to use targeted treatment approaches to help with treatment or prevention of certain diseases. But again, we are not there yet. And then lastly, there's a lot of direct to consumer tests out there, tests that will, essentially tell you what your microbiome is, but these are not in any way diagnostic. They are not recommended by gastroenterologists or physicians because, again, we are currently having so many limitations that we don't really know what to do with that information yet. But that is definitely the area of research that it's moving towards, is going to be very individualized because it has to be. But we're not quite there just yet. So I just wanted to put that out there because I know there's a lot of products and things that are marketed as such, but really there's no evidence to back any of it up yet. All right, so going back to fiber and these non-digestible carbohydrates. So kind of a brief nutrition history or nutrition lesson. So carbohydrates are a macronutrient. And these consist of starches, sugars, and fibers. So fibers are essentially non-digestible by us. We cannot break these down and utilize them for energy. So they will pass through our GI tract. And on the other hand, sugars are what does get broken down and absorbed and then utilized as an energy source. And then starches are usually longer chains of sugars. So some of these get broken down and can be used for energy. Other parts of them don't get broken down and remain undigested as well. So really, when we talk about types of products that are available to the microbiome, it's this category of non-digestible carbohydrates that are going to include fibers and then some starches that aren't digested. So I hope that makes sense. So we know that high fiber has always had a whole host of positive health outcomes associated with this. So we know that a high fiber intake is associated with a lower risk of heart disease, type 2 diabetes, diverticular disease, and even breast cancer risk. And fiber is found predominantly in plant sources. So fruits, vegetables, legumes, lentils, beans, whole grains, oats, barley, nuts, and seeds. But we also have to remind ourselves that when we eat food, we're not just eating a single nutrient. There's a whole host of benefits when we're consuming foods. So all of these plant-based sources are going to also include really beneficial phytochemicals, such as those antioxidants and polyphenols that also provide additional health benefits. So just going and taking a fiber supplement is not going to be the same as eating fruits and vegetables and other plant-based sources. So when we talk about fiber, it can be broken down into two categories. So there's what's known as soluble fibers and insoluble fibers. And insoluble fibers don't get broken down by the gut bacteria. These will essentially remain intact and as they pass through the GI tract. And so these are really helpful in terms of acting as a bulking agent and really can help in terms of, one, helping the individuals if you're struggling with constipation, but also in general, just keeping things moving through the system and moving through at a pretty decent transit time. The other hand, there's soluble fiber, which will form more of a gel consistency throughout the GI tract. And these are what is utilized by the gut bacteria. And soluble fiber has also been shown to be helpful with lowering cholesterol because it will kind of grab onto that and pull it through. Now, I just want to note, you don't need to worry about trying to consume insoluble versus soluble fibers. There's benefits to consuming both, and a lot of foods are going to have a mixture of both. So I'm just saying this in terms of helping to get more information, but the take-home message is just up fiber intake. So you don't need to worry about one or the other. And as I mentioned, fiber isn't the only particle that remains undigested. There are parts of starches that are also remaining, resisting digestion as well. And so these are aptly named resistant starches. So these resist that digestion in the small intestine and make it to the large intestine, where they are fermented and utilized by the gut microbiome. And these have been associated with increased feelings of fullness, also decreased cholesterol, and even lower risk of colon cancer. And these are found in really specific items, so plantains and green bananas, but they're also predominantly found in cooked and cooled rice and potatoes. And in particular, so this basically means if you prepare a rice dish or potatoes and then you heated it up, and then the next day you either ate it cold or you heated it back up again, it doesn't really matter. But the act of cooking and cooling these products actually increases the amount of resistant starch within them. So these are also really beneficial for our microbiome, but also those other benefits. So kind of to summarize, we use the term non-digestible carbohydrates, which are going to include those specific, more soluble fibers and resistant starches. These are what are actually available to the gut bacteria, which provide that energy, which produce then those beneficial short-chain fatty acids. So talking a little bit then about pre and probiotics. So the definition of a prebiotic is a substrate that is selectively utilized by host microorganisms that confers a health benefits. So this is where those specific non-digestible carbohydrates will act actually as prebiotics, because they are going to be utilized by those microbiome, by those bacteria, and they produce the health benefits of leading to production of short-chain fatty acids. So this is why you actually don't need to buy prebiotic supplements or look for foods that have prebiotics. These foods are going to be found in those fiber-rich foods. So again, consuming fruits, vegetables, beans, whole grains are all going to have great sources of these prebiotic fibers, as I mentioned previously. In particular, there are some sources that have been noted to be really high in this. So oats, asparagus, onion, garlic, wheat, barley, apples, bananas, peas, and beans. But again, any and all sources are going to contain these prebiotics naturally. And with all of this stuff, there's a very highly individualized response. Again, in terms of how your body is going to tolerate it, how much. And so this is also why recommending or prescribing prebiotics, we're just not at a place yet to really be able to do that. But getting these sources from food have all of those amazing benefits. All right, so those are the prebiotics. Probiotics are a little different. Their definition is a live microorganism that, when administered in adequate amounts, confers a health benefit on the host. So the thing I really want to hit home about with probiotics is that there's a very specific strain-specific benefit. So for something to be a probiotic, when you're in the store and you see a probiotic, this means that specific bacteria strains, so specific strains with a specific dose given for a specific period of time, have shown to offer some benefit for a certain condition. And really, to date, the ones that we see these benefits are for antibiotic-associated diarrhea, for constipation, H. pylori infection, and depending on the individual, there might be some relief of IBS symptoms. But this is why it's incredibly important to know which probiotic you're getting, because you might, if you just walk into a store and grab a probiotic off the shelf, it might be indicated for H. pylori infection, but maybe you want it for constipation. So it's not going to have the intended effect, because that's not what that one was shown to be effective for. So if you are looking to purchase a probiotic, you need to understand which probiotic, so which species and strain specific, and that will help to show which product has been found to actually be beneficial. And then also following the storage instructions. So some of them are shelf stable, others of them need to be refrigerated. And these are classified as supplements, which means that there still is a lack of oversight and regulation. There can be issues with accuracy, reliability, contamination. So it can be helpful to buy a brand that has had an independent third-party quality test, something like the USP verification. It doesn't completely minimize that, but it does show typically it's a better product. So there are questions though around the use of probiotics in individuals that are immunocompromised, just because this is a live bacteria. So if that is the case, you definitely want to talk to your doctor before taking these. And I have seen, probiotics recommended for like every ailment under the sun. Again, really so far, the only specific ones that have shown are the ones that I've kind of demonstrated up there. And if you aren't having GI issues, taking a probiotic isn't really going to do anything or help anything. So I hope that kind of breaks down some of the mystery around probiotics. The other kind of interesting product too is probiotic yogurt. So there are yogurts that will say and have the label probiotic on them. And this is because yogurt, one, is naturally fermented and does contain specific bacteria. And then certain yogurts will have additional bacteria added into them, like Bifido or lactobacillus. And it's been shown that these strains improve the digestion of lactose among individuals with lactose intolerance. So that's where the yogurt can fall under this label of a probiotic, because it's conferring that health benefits of improving digestion of lactose among those that are lactose intolerant. And this is why a lot of individuals find that they can tolerate these kinds of yogurts, even if they have a lactose intolerance. So it doesn't mean you're getting all these other benefits. It really is intended for that specific effect. So kind of a great segue into fermented foods. So yogurt, again, is one of these, but there's also kefir, sauerkraut, kimchi, kombucha, miso. And these do not fit the definition of a probiotic. I know I've seen these labeled as probiotic, but none of these fit that definition, besides the yogurt one where they have added in those cultures. But everything else does not meet the definition. And this is because although these fermented foods do naturally contain strands of bacteria, there's no way to know the amount, the strains, and it's going to vary like batch to batch, essentially, because so many different things factor into making the product. So they don't know in that kombucha that you're drinking what bacteria strains are in there and how much, let alone then being able to show that it has an intended health benefit. The additional issue is that oftentimes if these products are heated or pasteurized, that can unfortunately kill most of any of the live bacteria that is within them. So again, this is where there's just no way for us to really know by the time you're drinking it what's even in that. But although these aren't considered a probiotic, there are still benefits to consuming these types of foods. A lot of individuals find that they, especially if there are some digestive issues, that fermented foods are often much more easily digested. This is also true with like sourdough bread. Some people find that they can tolerate sourdough, but maybe not regular bread. And this is because it's been fermented. They also typically contain beneficial fibers or other phytochemicals that are going to be beneficial for our gut and overall health. So incorporating those foods are still beneficial, even if it's not going to give a quote unquote probiotic intended effect. So kind of then taking a step back and looking at lifestyle factors that can affect digestion. Stress is a huge one. So depending on what's going on, I think everyone can relate to when we feel stressed. Oftentimes we tend to feel it in our stomach. We might feel nauseous, have an upset stomach, feel like there's a lot of tension or like, some heaviness there. So we feel a lot of these effects within our stomach. And again, this is because of that gut-brain axis where our gut and our brain have communication pathways. So this is where we oftentimes feel those physical effects really resonate. And in particular, individuals with IBS, a huge part of the treatment is actually stress management and stress reduction strategies. So that can definitely impact digestion. Inadequate hydration. Our body needs fluid, especially to keep things moving throughout the GI tract. So that can lead to a lot of constipation if there's not enough hydration. Something that I see happen for a lot of individuals is that they're eating really quickly. They're eating while they're watching TV or on their computers. They're not chewing their food. And this can also lead to more issues with digestion, bloating, gas, abdominal discomfort. And also lack of movement. So our entire digestive tract is essentially made up of muscles, and then individual muscles are moving food throughout our digestive tract. So if we're not moving, also stuff tends to sit in there. So making sure that we're getting adequate movement is really essential to increasing that. And then not consuming enough fiber. So as I mentioned earlier, there's definitely those fibers that help to push things through, and then we're also not getting those other benefits. So some ways to optimize digestive health. Fiber, right? So we know fiber tends to be the biggest determinant of those short chain fatty acids. And so the USDA daily recommended intake is 25 grams of fiber a day for women and 38 grams of fiber a day for men. However, in every single study that's ever been done, Americans struggle to get fiber. And so most adults are getting 15 grams. I mean, even that sometimes is a pretty high number, unfortunately. So most people benefit from adding fiber to their diets. But you don't want to just go gung-ho and add a ton of fiber because that can lead to a lot of GI distress. So you want to increase fiber slowly, making sure you're adding fluid and hydration as well in order to combat any type of GI distress. So usually they recommend adding no more than 5 extra grams a day. So maybe starting with like 1 serving of fiber and going from there. And again, any and all sources are great. There's no better or worse. Having variety is going to be optimal. So maybe some ways to start increasing fiber could be instead of cereal for breakfast, have oatmeal. And I know for a lot of people, they struggle to have fruit or vegetables, and in particular with breakfast. So an easy tip is to throw some berries in your oatmeal, or if you're someone that likes a more savory breakfast, can you throw some spinach or tomatoes in with those eggs? You can also incorporate, a meatless meal once a week where you're having a vegetarian chili instead of a turkey chili. But even adding fiber to existing dishes is fine. So even if you're like, I love my turkey chili, cool, add some beans in there. Do what you can to still up the fiber intake in the meals you're already making. Likewise, adding, a side to a meal. So adding a plant food is kind of what I like to say. So having a fruit or a vegetable with your lunch, with your dinner, is another great idea. And then also things like snacks. It might be really easy to gravitate towards the chips, the cookies, but opting for things like carrots with hummus or apple with peanut butter are again going to provide a lot more of that fiber. So in general, the more we can eat more whole types of foods and less of the ultra processed foods, we're going to naturally increase fiber. Oftentimes those ultra processed foods, the cookies, the pastries, the desserts are all stripped of any fiber at that point. So kind of the main things to focus on is increasing plant food intake. And again, those whole types of foods. So adding whole grains, fruits, vegetables, beans, nuts, seeds, lentils, anywhere you can add this into your daily routine is going to naturally up that fiber intake. And I also want to note that it doesn't mean you need to be vegan or vegetarian. You can still eat animal foods and get health benefits from eating animal foods. It's more just about adding in the fiber to what you're already doing. You can also look at maybe stress management, especially if that's an area that you know is an area that you struggle with. Meditation has been shown to be so beneficial, not only just for stress management, but like lowering cortisol levels and helping with GI distress. Likewise, mindful eating practices can be a great way to slow down, pay more attention to your food, actually savor and taste the food so it's a more enjoyable experience. And then movement. So just getting up, walking more, even doing yoga. It doesn't mean you have to go anything intensive, but the more that we're moving our bodies throughout the day, that will also help keep things moving throughout our GI tract. And same with hydration. I know that's a tough one. I'm going to talk a lot more about hydration in the next presentation and ways to up hydration, because I know that that's just a tough area for a lot of individuals, but anywhere you can increase that consumption of water in particular is going to be helpful. And then if there is a certain condition, like I mentioned, constipation or antibiotic-associated diarrhea, where a probiotic may be indicated, then it might be helpful. Other than that, it's usually not going to really offer any benefits. And then if you are having chronic issues or just GI distress and discomfort, definitely working with a physician, seeing a gastroenterologist to try to determine the root cause and what's really going on. And then from there, you can always work with a dietitian, depending on if there are going to be certain like medical nutrition guidelines in terms of things that can be helpful for whatever is going on. Alrighty, so I feel like I went through that pretty fast. So definitely let me know if there are any and all questions related to digestive health.